Welcome back to Triathlon Training Explained, powered by TrainingPeaks. Now then, did you know that up to 60% of the human body is made up of water? Up to 93% of our blood is made of water, and our muscles are made up of up to 73% water. Now, needless to say, hydration is pretty darn important. In fact, as endurance athletes, we can slow our pace by around 2% for each percent of body weight lost through dehydration. Now, obviously, that is a very, very rough figure and can vary quite considerably from athlete to athlete. But let's not get stuck into that, because one thing for sure is that we really want to avoid dehydration if we want to perform at our best, which is what brings us here today, because I want to explore dehydration and help you by showing you the effects and impact of dehydration, how to identify it, and how to avoid it altogether. Well, I think I made it fairly clear already, but this stuff here is really quite important. It maintains our blood volume, it helps to regulate our body temperature, and it also allows muscle contractions to take place. Now, during exercise, it becomes increasingly more important, because as we exercise, we heat up. And to maintain that optimal body temperature, we sweat, which unfortunately is something I'm really quite good at. Now, this sweat is produced to get rid of the heat from our body, and that is then evaporated from our skin. But obviously that is a big contributing factor to this potential dehydration and fluid loss. And obviously that all increases with a rise in ambient temperature, humidity, and intensity. Now, fluid can obviously be lost in all sorts of different ways, but sweat is certainly the biggie during exercise, because if we're not replenishing those lost fluids, then that's where dehydration can sneak its way in. And if we are competing as an athlete, and that does happen to us, then this can cause all sorts of issues. You could suffer from cramps, muscle spasms, or muscle soreness, which is not good. We can have a feeling of fatigue, which again is not good, or even impaired concentration, which is really, really not good during exercise or during competition. Now, I'm actually talking from experience here, because as I mentioned earlier, I sweat a lot. So this is something I had to be really wary of during competitions and during training, because otherwise I would suffer from cramps if I got myself dehydrated. And it's important to note that this wasn't just during hot races or a hot climate, because actually you can still get dehydrated in cooler climates if you're not replenishing or replacing those lost fluids. So it's really important that we can identify the signs.
Oh dear. Oh dear, that's really not good.
It's okay, it's not what you think. Now, you can find out whether you're dehydrated or not by the colour of your urine, believe it or not. Now, the darker and more concentrated that colour, the more dehydrated you are. Now, I know that's rather crude, but it's biology, and that's what happens. Now, if we take a look at these colours here, this rather pale or clear colour towards the top would suggest that you're well hydrated. But as we start to move down that and it becomes a more like pale honey colour, well, that suggests that you're on the way to becoming slightly dehydrated, and you should start thinking about taking on some fluid fairly soon. As we move down to slightly darker, slightly more concentrated colour, you are, well, dehydrated already, so you should be taking on some fluid ASAP. And as we get right down to the bottom here, it's a very concentrated dark colour. You should get yourself to a doctor now. But obviously we can't always check our urine, so there are other things that would suggest that you may be dehydrated. So one of those is that you basically just feeling thirsty. You might have a dry mouth or a dry nose. You might have a headache or feel rather lightheaded. Another thing is muscle cramps, or even you might feel irritable or be suffering from some sort of confusion. Right, well, that's enough about the effects and the signs of dehydration. It's about time that we tell you how to prevent it altogether. So for this, I brought in a good friend of mine, Andy Blow. Andy is a bit of a hydration expert, to say the least. So what should you be doing as an athlete to prevent dehydration?
I think dehydration and hydration has become really complicated in some people's minds, and it's not actually that complicated. And one of the first things that athletes have got to learn to do is tune into what their body's telling them and drink when they're thirsty. That's that's fundamentally really important. It's not the be all and end all, but listening to your body and making sure that you're not, waiting until you're really, really thirsty to drink, but getting on top of it early is a good place to start.
So how could it potentially differ from athlete to athlete?
I think one of the classic ways in which it differs is that elite athletes are a lot more in tune with their bodies often than more novice athletes. When you're a novice and you're, on the bike in a long distance Ironman, for example, you've got loads of different things and sensations that you're thinking about, your pace, and it's all new, and you aren't necessarily focusing inwardly on what your body's feeling like. So sometimes novice athletes find it harder to realise that they're thirsty until it's too late, and then they've not drunk enough, and then their performance goes downhill. Whenever we work with and talk to elite athletes, though, they're incredibly in tune with their bodies, and they're listening to them all the time, and therefore keeping on top of it a bit better. Okay,
and we've spoken a lot already about the fluid, but very generically, there's more to fluid though, isn't there?
Yeah, when you sweat and in your body, there's a lot of electrolytes in your fluid as well. Particularly, there's a lot of sodium, which is the same as the sodium chloride. It's the same as the sodium you find in salt. So that's why you sometimes see salt marks on your skin and clothing when you're racing in hot conditions. And you can lose quite a lot of that, especially if you sweat a lot, if it's really hot, or if you're going for a long period of time. So making sure that you're getting some electrolytes in with fluids when you're sweating a lot is really, really important.
Okay, so now let's talk about an event. So you've got a big Ironman race coming up, for instance. What would you do in the lead up to that event?
In the build-up, one of the big mistakes people can make is drinking way too much water. So we see that a lot. People think I'm going to be more well hydrated, like I'm going to eat more pasta and have more carbohydrates on board, so they just start nailing water. I know the first time when I raced out in Hawaii, it wasn't actually for Ironman, it was for Xterra, for the Worlds out there, and I thought in the days before, I'm not going to get dehydrated, so I was chugging water and going to the toilet every 5 minutes thinking I'm really well hydrated, but actually all I'm doing is washing electrolytes and fluid through my body. So the first thing is, don't drink too much. So drink maybe a little bit more than you would, an extra bottle of water or so a day, but not too much. In the final 24 hours, what you can also do is drink some very strong electrolyte drinks that are much, much stronger than a standard one, and that will help your body retain a little bit of extra fluid for race day.
Okay, so essentially like preloading the body.
Yeah, but it's just in the last few hours. It's not something which you start, 3 days before.
Okay, race day then. What are we doing then with our hydration on the bike and everything?
Well, I think if you aiming to start hydrated, so having a bottle of strong electrolytes with your breakfast, not loads, but maybe half a litre or so, instead of a bottle of water is a good idea. Then what we advise most athletes in a long distance race to do is start on the bike with whatever your drinks you prefer there, because then you're not going to you can't control what you can pick up on the course, but you can control what you start with. So you start with some drinks there. And for most athletes, even at a high level, we would say start with a bit of a plan for roughly how much you think you're going to drink each hour, and try and stick with that for the first hour or two. Because even, I was talking to pro athlete Tim Reed about this very recently, and I was saying, do you drink when you're thirsty or do you drink to a plan? And he said, I always drink to a plan in the first portion of the race, because the fight or flight response is so strong, you're sort of nervous and you just want to stick with your plan, and then maybe later on as you get further into it you become a bit more dynamic. So I'd say start off with a plan, know roughly how much you're going to drink, but then be prepared to modify that as the day wears on and as you start listening to your body a bit more and as you start to relax.
Great. And obviously the bit that a lot of people forget about is post-event, post-race, or even big training session. I think everyone's just happy to get over and done with, but actually it's a big part to think about, isn't it?
It is, if you want to recover faster, if that's a priority. So often for a lot of people, I would say if it's a major race and they're having loads of days off afterwards and all the rest of it, you want to think about optimising recovery a bit, but mostly you want to think about relaxing and having a good time. Where it's most important, I think, is rehydrating effectively after a big training session where you do want to get up and back it up with another solid session the next day. And again, you want to think about the electrolyte content of what you drink, because the more sodium you can put in it, the more you can retain it in the body. And there's lots of scientific studies that show basically a direct relationship between the amount of sodium in a drink and the amount that you retain, so you can rehydrate a lot faster if you take an electrolyte drink afterwards.
Okay, and also you touched earlier on your Xterra experience of drinking a bit too much. This actually quite a big topic in itself of almost like overhydrating.
Yeah, it happens all the time, and what's really interesting is that there's no recorded deaths, not that I'm aware of anyway, of anyone dying of dehydration in an event, because people's urge to drink is so powerful. If you get thirsty enough to be very, very dehydrated, you can find water on a course of a race and drink it. Where people have got it wrong, and this happens reasonably frequently, is people overconsume water or fluids that are low in electrolytes and actually dilute their bodies and get a condition called hyponatremia. So I think it was about 2013, they did a study at Ironman Frankfurt in the heat and found that 10% of finishers had looked like they'd drunk too much because they were hyponatremic at the finish line. And then in 2015, a guy actually died there from hyponatremia after the race. So although dehydration is going to be bad for your performance, the other side of the coin is also pretty bad as well.
Okay, we spoke a little bit just before about the individual needs. What about in terms of how much fluids, electrolytes? Obviously that differs from person to person, right?
Yeah, the whole thing differs quite a lot, and I would say it is hard to generalise, but we see, when we test people in the lab, we see anything up to about 5 or 6 times difference in sweat rates and up to a 10 times difference in salt loss in sweat. So two people's hydration plan is never going to look the same. We might see very small athletes in cool conditions with low sweat rates who might get away with drinking only a few hundred millilitres an hour, even in a really long race, and they might not need to take much in the way of electrolyte supplementation at all, because they're just not losing it at a big rate. Right at the other end, we've worked with athletes, particularly actually cyclists in sort of long pro tour events, because they're out there 5-6 hours a day back to back, and some of them will drink in hotter stages up to 1.5 litres per hour, and they might take 1.5 to 2 grams of sodium with that, just for relatively constrained periods of time to replace what they're losing. So that range is massive, and each individual can fall anywhere in between that.
And I think one of the big misconceptions I've been learning from yourself quite recently is actually just because you think you sweat loads doesn't mean you're necessarily losing lots of salt. In my case, it means I am doing both, unfortunately. But some people, you could just say, oh, look, I sweat loads, I must be losing a lot of salt, so I need a lot of electrolytes. But actually, it's not quite as simple as that, right?
No, not always. Those two things can be independent. I mean, ultimately, if you're doing a long event and you've got a high sweat rate, the amount of salt you lose over a period of time could be really high. So people who sweat more tend to benefit more from supplementation than those that don't. But yeah, that said, you could have a high sweat rate but a very low level of salt loss, or you could be like me and like you and have a high sweat rate and a high salt loss, and then it's kind of the worst of both worlds then.
As mentioned already, dehydration can seriously hamper our performance. So hopefully today's video has been helpful for you, and it's been fantastic getting Andy in today and getting some advice from him on that matter. Now, if you liked today's video, please do hit that thumbs up button. If you'd like to see more from GTN, just hit that globe and you subscribe to the channel. Now, if you'd like to see that previous video we did with Andy, which looked into sweat rates and the amount of salt that we lose, where Heather and myself actually went into the lab at Silverstone with Andy, and you can see that by clicking just down here.